I have always believed that every murder case begins long before the first clue appears, before the first witness speaks, before the first headline hits the morning paper. A murder begins in the quiet hours of ordinary life, in the unnoticed moments, in the fragile threads that tie people together and just as easily tear them apart. And on January 13th, 1999, in the city of Baltimore, one of those threads snapped. My name is Miller Files. I have spent my life studying human darkness, the kind that hides in plain sight beneath classrooms, friendships, teenage romances, and the illusion that life is predictable. But the day Hae Min Lee vanished, nothing was predictable. Not for her family, not for her school, not for her community, and certainly not for the young man who would later become the center of one of America's most controversial murder cases, Adnan Syed. To understand this case, we must start not with theories or accusations, but with the last day she was seen alive, the day the ordinary began to unravel. It was a Wednesday, a day so normal that most people forget it as soon as it ends. Students at Woodlawn High School shuffled through the halls, their backpacks heavy with textbooks, and their minds already drifting to weekend plans. Winter sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching the dust in the air, turning it gold. No one could have known that within a few hours, the school would become the starting point of a mystery that would echo for decades. Hae Min Lee was 18 years old, a student athlete, popular, ambitious, full of promise. People said she had a spark in her that made her both admired and envied. She was confident yet kind, driven yet warm. That morning, she laughed with her friends between classes. She joked with her teammates. She talked about her plans for the afternoon. She had responsibilities, dreams, a life that stretched forward like a clear road. And then she was gone. Disappearance is a strange thing. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream. It simply happens quietly, silently, like the flicker of a light going out. Someone is here one moment, and the next moment they are not. But beneath that silence, a storm begins to form. Families panic. Friends whisper. Investigators look for patterns. Reporters wait. And the world begins to speculate. When the final school bell rang at Woodlawn High, I walked into a crowded hallway one last time. Students noticed her passing by, but didn't realize they were witnessing the final image of her alive. She had mentioned needing to pick up her little cousin from school. She mentioned a few errands, but that was all. Nothing unusual, nothing concerning. Just another day in the life of a teenage girl. But somewhere between the school doors and her expected destination, Hashi disappeared into the shadows of Baltimore. When the police first took the missing persons report, they treated it like so many others involving teenagers. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she was with friends. Maybe she would come home. Maybe everything would sort itself out. But parents know the difference between rebellion and danger. Hae's family insisted something was wrong. They felt it immediately, instinctively, like a sudden drop in temperature. In investigation work, instinct matters. It does not solve cases on its own, but it tells you when to stop assuming and start digging deeper. And in this case, instinct was right. Over the next 24 hours, the first cracks began to appear in the perfectly normal story of Hae Min Lee's day. She did not show up to pick up her cousin. She did not attend work. She did not call anyone. She did not return home. Her car was nowhere to be found, and there was no trace of movement on anything that connected her to the world. When a person disappears without any digital footprint, without calls, without witnesses, without physical evidence, the possibilities narrow quickly and dramatically. And when that person is a young woman with no history of running away, the alarm bells start ringing. Within 2 days, detectives began to widen the scope of inquiry. They spoke with friends, classmates, teachers, co-workers, relatives. Patterns emerged. Names surfaced, and one name surfaced more than the others, not because of evidence, but because of human tendency. Whenever there is a disappearance involving a young woman, investigators look toward the person closest to her emotionally. That person was Adnan Syed. At the time, Adnan was 17 years old, handsome, soft-spoken, polite. A student who prayed at the mosque, played sports, volunteered at his local community center. But like any teenager, he had a life with complications. He and Hae had dated secretly, navigating the tension between cultural expectations and personal desire. Their breakup had left emotional bruises, visible only to those who paid attention. To an investigator searching for motive, heartbreak is an easy answer, too easy. When I reviewed the initial statements years later, what struck me was not guilt or innocence, but how quickly the investigation narrowed its focus, as if one storyline had already been chosen before the evidence had a chance to speak. But evidence has a voice of its own. And on January 13th, 1999, that voice was still silent. In the early stages of a missing persons case, there is always a clock ticking. Every hour matters. And in those hours after Hae vanished, people who cared about her tried to fill in the blanks. Friends said she had seemed normal that day. Some said she had been in a hurry. Others mentioned she had plans with her new boyfriend, Dawn. Several said she had conversations throughout the day with Adnan, though none described anything alarming. These were fragments of memory, scattered pieces that would later become the cornerstones of courtroom arguments, media narratives, and public debates. But the truth is this: memory is fragile. It bends under pressure. It rewrites itself without permission. It fills in gaps. And in a case like this, memory can become as dangerous as a lie. As the days passed with no sign of Hae, the fear grew into dread. And dread turned into grief when, on February 9th, 1999, her body was discovered in a shallow grave in Leakin Park, a place known for secrets, a place where people went to hide what they didn't want found, a place where the earth itself seemed to swallow truth. Her body had been buried hurriedly. No attempt at a ritual, no attempt at concealment beyond the bare minimum. It suggested panic, not planning, impulse, not strategy, rage, not calculation. Several weeks had passed since she disappeared, which meant the window for collecting pristine evidence had closed. Time washes away clues. Weather erases prints. Animals disturb remains. And in Leakin Park, nature reclaims quickly. Still, a line had been crossed. A missing girl was now a murder victim. And murder demands answers. When the investigation shifted formally into a homicide case, the pressure intensified. The media began circling. The community demanded justice. And justice, when demanded loudly enough, can make investigators move faster than they should, assume more than they know, and cling to the first theory that seems to make sense. But a murder investigation is not about what seems to make sense. It is about what can be proven. And at that moment, there was nothing that directly pointed to Adnan Syed. No fingerprints, no DNA, no physical evidence connecting him to the burial site, no eyewitness confirming he was with Hae after school, nothing that tied him to the crime scene. What investigators did have was a story, not evidence. A story waiting for someone to tell it, and then that someone appeared, a young man named Jay Wilds. Jay would become the voice that shaped the entire direction of the case, the witness whose words would help build a prosecution narrative strong enough to convict. But on the first day of the investigation, before Jay spoke, before the accusations began, before the courtroom battles and the media frenzy and the appeals years later, there was only this: a girl who left school and never made it home, a city that whispered with fear, and a mystery that had just begun to unfold. This is part one of the story, the beginning of a case that would test the limits of truth, memory, justice, and human fallibility. The beginning of a case that would pull me, Miller Files, deep into a labyrinth of contradictions, unreliable witnesses, and unanswered questions. And as any detective knows, the beginning is where you find the cracks that later become earthquakes. But the real storm was still ahead. Now we step into part two, where the investigation takes its first dramatic turn and where the name Jay Wilds transforms from an acquaintance into the key witness whose shifting story would redefine everything. Every investigation reaches a moment when the silence begins to crack. A moment when someone steps forward, not because the truth compels them, but because pressure, fear, or opportunity pushes them into the center of the narrative. In the case of Hae Min Lee's murder, that moment arrived when a young man named Jay Wilds walked into the investigation. I remember the first time I studied Jay's statements. They did not form a straight line. They bent, twisted, curved, then unraveled. They contradicted themselves in places where truth should be solid. Yet, despite the inconsistencies, despite the shadows in his story, Jay's voice became the foundation of the prosecution's case against Adnan Syed. And to understand this case, you must understand Jay, or at least understand the version of Jay that appeared in police interviews. Because, beginning with his first statement, the entire direction of the investigation shifted, and the story of that January day was rewritten through his lens. Before Jay spoke, the investigation was drifting. Detectives had questions but no answers, a body but no timeline, suspicions but no proof. They needed clarity, or something that resembled it, and Jay offered precisely that: a story, a narrative. A confession disguised as second-hand memory. But memory can be a dangerous storyteller. Jay was not a close friend of Adnan's, but their social circles overlapped. They bought weed together, they talked occasionally, they shared mutual acquaintances. They were connected enough for the police to believe Jay might know something, but not so close that his accusations seemed motivated by personal loyalty. In the eyes of investigators, that made him perfect. When Jay sat down for his first official interview, his voice was calm. That calmness is what struck me. Most witnesses in high-profile murder cases tremble, hesitate, or show signs of emotional disturbance. But Jay spoke as if he were narrating a story he had already practiced in his mind. He said that on the afternoon of Hadi's disappearance, Adnan had shown him her lifeless body in the trunk of her car. That single allegation detonated the case like an explosion. It was the detail investigators had been waiting for, the missing piece that suddenly transformed suspicion into potential evidence. And once Jay said those words, everything changed. Detectives moved faster. Questions sharpened. The focus tightened around Adnan as if Jay had flipped a switch that illuminated only one suspect. But the moment I examined the timeline Jay provided, the gaps became impossible to ignore. He claimed that Adnan had strangled Hae behind a Best Buy parking lot, but early versions of the story placed the murder at different times. Later versions shifted the location. Details vanished, reappeared, and mutated. It was as if the story existed in a flexible state, adjusting itself to the needs of the moment. Still, investigators believed Jay. They needed him. Without his narrative, they had no case. When you look at the structure of his statements, a pattern emerges. Jay's story always filled the precise void that police needed filled. Whenever investigators lacked a motive, Jay provided one. Whenever they needed a timeline, Jay constructed it. Whenever they needed a reason why Adnan would involve him, Jay invented just enough familiarity to make the involvement seem plausible. But there is something else to consider. Jay never placed himself physically near the moment of the murder. He positioned himself as a reluctant accomplice, someone caught in a situation he did not choose. He portrayed himself as a young man dragged into darkness by someone else's decisions, and that framing allowed him to stand inside the investigation without ever being the target of it. When I studied the transcripts, I noticed something subtle. Jay never seemed afraid of being charged. He never asked whether he was in trouble. He never expressed panic over the possibility of facing prison. It was almost as if he already knew he wouldn't, or as if someone had implied that cooperation ensured safety. That implication soon became the invisible engine of the entire case. Detectives reconstructed the day of January 13th using Jay's memories as their blueprint. According to his most stable version, Adnan left school, borrowed his car to Len Jay called Hae to arrange a ride, then waited behind Best Buy, where the murder took place. Jay said Adnan later called him to pick him up, and together they disposed of the body. But the truth is more fragile than the presentation. No witness ever confirmed seeing Adnan and Hae leave together. No physical evidence tied Adnan to the trunk of the car. No fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA, nothing. And when detectives asked Jay why Adnan would show him the body, he said that Adnan trusted him. But trust between them was, at best, thin. Still, once investigators believed the story, they reenacted it step by step, testing only the portions that seemed plausible and ignoring the pieces that contradicted other evidence. Jay's narrative became the backbone, and everything else bent around it. There is a moment in every investigation when a detective realizes a story is being forced into shape instead of discovered organically. When I read the full timeline, I felt that moment immediately. It was as if the truth was a puzzle, and Jay was providing pieces that didn't quite fit, but were hammered into place anyway. For example, Jay said the burial took place around midnight, yet phone records suggested different times, and when detectives confronted him with contradictions, he adjusted the timeline without hesitation, as if the exact details were negotiable. Truth is not negotiable. I kept returning to the same question: why would someone lie in such a complicated and detailed way? Fear is one possibility. Pressure is another. But perhaps the most compelling is self-preservation. If Jay knew something or had been present in ways he had not admitted, crafting a version of the story where he remained on the periphery would protect him from legal consequences. It is impossible to ignore that Jay, unlike Adnan, had things to lose if police decided he was more involved than he first admitted. And the moment he positioned himself as the witness who could provide closure, investigators granted him credibility instead of suspicion. But credibility is not the same as truth. Jay's narrative shaped the prosecution's theory. It shaped the courtroom strategy. It shaped the jury's understanding. And years later, it shaped the public's outrage when the inconsistencies came to light. When Adnan was arrested, the story felt complete to those who wanted closure. A breakup, a jealous ex-boyfriend, a young woman murdered. a friend who came forward with insider knowledge. It echoed familiar narratives people had seen before in movies and television. But reality does not follow cinematic structure. Reality is messy, confusing, contradictory, and the contradictions in Jay's story were thunderclaps no one heard because they were too focused on the storm they believed had already passed. But the storm had not passed. It had only begun. By the time Jay testified in court, his words had been shaped through multiple interviews. They had hardened into a version that supported the prosecution's theory. The jury heard a polished narrative, not the unstable drafts that preceded it. And because his story included details only a killer or someone close to the killer could know, the jury believed him. A witness can determine a man's fate more efficiently than any physical evidence. And that is what happened here. Yet the more I examined the statements, the clearer it became that Jay's story said more about Jay than it did about Adnan. It reflected fear. It reflected survival. It reflected the possibility that Jay knew far more about what happened that day than he ever admitted. Some investigators have privately suggested that Jay might have been closer to the events than he let on. Some believe he may have helped more than burying the body. Others believe he may have witnessed something he refused to confess. And others believe he may have been hiding his own involvement entirely. There is a moment in the investigation when the truth begins to slip away, and that moment, in this case, is tied to Jay's first interview. Because from that point forward, the investigation did not seek answers. It sought confirmation, and when an investigation seeks confirmation instead of truth, the outcome becomes predetermined. Jay was the witness who changed everything, but not because he revealed the truth. He changed everything because he created a story the investigators were willing to believe. As a detective, I have learned that the most dangerous narratives are not the ones created with malice. They are the ones created with fragments of truth, woven with assumptions, fear, and the quiet pressure of police interrogation. Jay Wilde stepped into the investigation as a young man with information, but he walked out as the architect of a story that would send another young man to prison for life. And the cracks in that story would only grow deeper in the years to come. Part 2 ends here, at the threshold of the courtroom where Jay's testimony becomes gospel and Adnan becomes the accused, not by evidence, but by narrative. In Part 3, we enter the trial itself, the shaping of the prosecution's case, and how the courtroom became the stage where truth was overshadowed by performance. Courtrooms are strange arenas. They are places where truth is supposed to shine, but often the brightest light in the room is the performance rather than the evidence. As a detective, I learned early that a trial is not simply the search for truth. A trial is a narrative battle. It is a contest between two stories, each crafted, polished, rehearsed, and delivered to an audience whose understanding of the world is shaped by emotion as much as reason. And in the case of Adnan Syed, the trial was less a discovery of truth than the execution of a story that had already found its villain. By the time the prosecution brought the case to court, Jay Wilde had transformed from a young man with an inconsistent story into the centerpiece of a narrative designed to convict. He was the witness who had seen the body. He was the witness who knew the plan. He was the witness who could take a murder with no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and turn it into a timeline the jury could understand. And juries, like all human beings, crave understanding. For the public, a murder is an act of violence. But for a courtroom, a murder becomes a puzzle, and puzzles require pieces, even if some pieces do not quite fit. Jay provided the pieces, The prosecution arranged them, and the courtroom accepted them. The trial began with a tone of confidence from the prosecution that felt almost rehearsed. They presented Adnan as a young man torn between cultural expectations and forbidden romance. They painted him as controlling, jealous, resentful, and emotionally volatile after his breakup with Hae. They did not need physical evidence because they had motive, and motive can be more seductive than science. I watched that trial unfold years later through transcripts, recordings, interviews, expert analysis. The same question echoed in my mind again and again. How did a case built on contradictions become so convincing? The answer lies in the structure of storytelling. A breakup, a beautiful, ambitious young woman, a secret romance, a young man humiliated, a friend who claims to have seen the body. It is a narrative people recognize. And when a story feels familiar, it feels true. From the moment Jay took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. He spoke with confidence, even when his story contradicted earlier statements. He described the burial in such vivid detail that the jury could picture it. He described the panic in Adnan's voice, as if he had memorized the emotion. He described his own reluctance, as if he were the unwilling bystander in a tragedy he did not choose. But beneath the theatrical clarity of his testimony, every investigator listening could hear the cracks. Times changed, locations shifted, memory drifted, but the prosecution guided him like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Whenever Jay stumbled, they helped steady him. Whenever he contradicted himself, they reframed the contradiction as confusion, fear, or trauma. And because he appeared remorseful, the jury forgave what they would not have forgiven from a suspect: inconsistency. Witnesses do not need to be perfect when the prosecution frames them as vulnerable. Meanwhile, Adnan sat silently at the defense table, a teenager in a suit that did not mask his youth. He watched as his life was reconstructed through someone else's memories, knowing that every word spoken against him created another invisible weight pressing down on the jury's mind. The defense tried to dismantle Jay's credibility. They pointed out the contradictions. They emphasized the absence of physical evidence. They highlighted the gaps in the investigation. They questioned the reliability of the cell tower records. They reminded the jury that no one other than Jay ever claimed Adnan confessed to anything. But the courtroom is not a laboratory. It does not examine evidence under a microscope. It examines tone, confidence, posture, emotion, and Jay, guided by the prosecution, communicated certainty. Adnan communicated youth. Uncertainty is forgiven in a witness. It is not forgiven in a defendant. The prosecution emphasized the cell phone records, presenting them with authority. Even though the underlying science was deeply flawed, they used them to reinforce Jay's timeline. Even though the timeline had changed multiple times, they combined the records with Jay's story to create the illusion of corroboration, a carefully constructed overlap between technology and narrative. But illusions are powerful in a courtroom because juries believe that data is truth. As I read through the trial transcript, I kept expecting a moment when someone would question the fundamental logic of the case. A moment when someone would say, "Why would Adnan choose to murder Hae in broad daylight in a public parking lot with no preparation, no plan, no motive strong enough to risk everything? Why would he involve Jay, a young man he barely trusted? Why would he leave no physical trace despite the chaotic nature of the crime? Why would he act impulsively when nothing in his past suggested violence?" That moment never came. Instead, The prosecution relied on the power of narrative momentum. Once the story began rolling downhill, nothing could stop it. Every witness who supported Jay's account was used as reinforcement. Every witness who contradicted it was reframed as unreliable. And the defense, despite exposing the holes, could not shift the emotional weight of the narrative. Trials are decided by stories that feel complete. Then came the closing arguments. The prosecution described Hae's last moments with dramatic force, as if reading from a script. They described Adnan as a young man whose pride had been wounded, whose emotions had turned dangerous. They described Jay as a reluctant participant forced into a nightmare. They described the burial as a final act of desperation. They never mentioned the absence of forensic evidence, because they did not need to. By then, the story had become complete. The defense, in contrast, focused on logic. But logic rarely wins against an emotional narrative. When the jury retired to deliberate, the result was almost predetermined. They convicted Adnan Syed of first-degree murder, life in prison. A teenager transformed into a symbol of jealousy, rage, and betrayal. The courtroom exhaled. The public believed justice had been served. The narrative was complete. But narratives can be misleading, and trials, especially those built on fragile foundations, often leave behind a residue of doubt that only grows with time. In the years that followed, the cracks in the case widened. Questions emerged. Experts challenged the cell tower evidence. Journalists scrutinized Jay's Timeline podcast. Investigators revealed inconsistencies. Lawyers uncovered procedural failures. New forensic tests undermined old assumptions, and the world began to ask whether the verdict had been built on the illusion of truth rather than truth itself. When I look back at the trial of Adnan Syed, I see a courtroom not guided by evidence, but by the gravitational pull of a story that felt complete before it ever reached the jury. A story pushed forward by a witness who may have been protecting himself. A story shaped by investigators who believed they had their man. A story reinforced by the prosecution's skillful framing. But truth is not a story. Truth is a process. By the end of the trial, the truth had been buried as deeply as Hae Min Lee, and in Part 4 we begin the excavation. We revisit the evidence. We confront the inconsistencies. We expose the failures, and we examine how the appeals process nearly shattered everything the prosecution built. The next phase is not just about uncovering mistakes. It is about confronting the possibility that the wrong man spent decades behind bars while the real killer walked free. When a case reaches the courtroom, the world assumes that the investigation is over, that the facts have been gathered, that the truth is sufficiently known. But in the case of Adnan Syed, the trial was not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of a much larger process, one that would stretch into the next 2 decades, a process that would peel away the layers of certainty until only doubt remained, a process that revealed how fragile the foundation of the prosecution's narrative truly was. There are cases where the evidence leads investigators to the truth, and there are cases where the evidence leads investigators away from it. Then, there are cases like this one, where the evidence does not lead anywhere at all, because the evidence was never properly examined. As the years passed and new eyes studied the details, the flaws in the police work began to surface. They did not appear all at once. They surfaced slowly, like cracks rising through the walls of a building long after the architect has left. Each crack revealed a deeper problem beneath the surface, and by the time the world noticed them, the entire structure of the case was already unstable. The first major flaw was the cell tower evidence. During the trial, Prosecutors displayed phone records as if they were scientific proof. They used colorful charts, maps, and diagrams. They pointed to timestamps and cell tower pings as though they were fingerprints. They framed the data as indisputable, objective, infallible. The jury saw numbers, and numbers looked like truth. But the truth behind those numbers was far more complicated. Years later, a crucial disclaimer emerged from the very company that provided the records. A warning printed on the documentation stated that incoming calls could not reliably indicate the location of the phone. In other words, the evidence presented at trial had been fundamentally misinterpreted. This should have shattered the prosecution's timeline. Instead, it had been the backbone of their case. The second flaw involved witness testimony. Jay Wilds, the prosecution's star witness, had altered his story repeatedly. Investigators knew this. Prosecutors knew this. Yet the jury only heard the polished final version, not the conflicting drafts that came before it. Imagine building a house on shifting sand. That is what the prosecution did. They constructed a narrative on the foundation of a witness whose story changed depending on who was asking and what they wanted to hear. Years later, when journalists and legal experts revisited the case, they noticed something disturbing. Each time investigators confronted Jay with inconsistencies, he adjusted his story to better align with the evidence they presented. It became clear that the investigation had not been a search for the truth. It had been a process of shaping a story until it fit a desired conclusion. The third flaw was the absence of forensic evidence. No fingerprints linked Adnan to Habri's car. No biological evidence put him at the burial site. No fibers tied him to the rope or clothing. Nothing physical placed him with Hae after school. The prosecution's case relied entirely on the notion that Adnan had strangled Hae with his bare hands, yet not a single physical trace supported this. It is nearly impossible to strangle someone in a confined space, transport the body, dig a grave, and bury it all without leaving any trace of yourself behind. Yet the prosecution argued that Adnan did exactly that, and the jury accepted it. But the most troubling flaw, the flaw that still haunts this case, was the failure to investigate alternative suspects. Evidence emerged years later indicating that at least 2 individuals had histories of violence toward women, had been in proximity to Hae, and had behavioral patterns consistent with the crime. Yet police never interviewed them thoroughly. Their names appeared in notes, then vanished from the official investigative path. This was not negligence. This was tunnel vision. When investigators fixate on a single suspect, their world narrows. They stop asking questions that lead in other directions. They stop following leads that contradict their theory. They stop seeing possibilities. And in doing so, they stop pursuing justice. This was the case with Asia McLean, the alibi witness who said she saw Adnan in the library at the exact time prosecutors claimed he was murdering Ha. Asia wrote letters. She offered to testify. She provided times and details. She begged to be included. Yet Adnan's original attorney failed to contact her. Her testimony was never heard by the jury. Imagine a young man sitting in a prison cell while the one person who saw him elsewhere was never allowed to speak. As new legal teams reviewed the case, they discovered additional failures. Evidence had not been tested. Witness notes had been ignored. Timelines had been manipulated. Expert opinions on cell data had been suppressed. Key inconsistencies had been glossed over. And, most significantly, the state had withheld information that may have supported the defense. In 2014, when the podcast Serial began to investigate, the world finally heard the case with fresh ears. Millions listened as inconsistencies were exposed. Millions heard the cracks in Jay's story. Millions understood how weak the physical evidence truly was. The podcast did not exonerate Adnan, but it accomplished something equally powerful. It made people question, and questioning is the beginning of truth. Following the podcast, new forensic tests were conducted. DNA samples were examined. Items found near the body were tested using methods unavailable in 1999, and the results were startling. None of the DNA matched Adnan Syed. At this point, the case should have been reopened. Instead, the process dragged on for years. Appeals were filed and denied. Hearings were scheduled, postponed, and rescheduled. Judges disagreed on technicalities. The law moved slowly while a young man aged behind bars. Then, in 2022, after more than 2 decades, prosecutors finally acknowledged what legal experts had suspected for years. The case against Adnan Syed had been flawed, incomplete, and unreliable. The conviction was vacated. Adnan walked out of prison, blinking into the sunlight, a free man for the first time in 23 years. But freedom did not come with closure. The legal battle continued. The conviction was reinstated, not because of new evidence, but because of procedural issues regarding how the vacating process had been handled. Once again, Adnan found himself trapped between innocence and guilt, between freedom and confinement, between truth and uncertainty. As I reviewed all these developments, one question kept haunting me. If the investigation had been done correctly in 1999, if evidence had been interpreted properly, if alternative suspects had been investigated, if Jay's contradictions had been taken seriously, if Asia McClain had testified, would the outcome have been different? The answer is undeniable. Yes, because an investigation built on unstable ground cannot hold the weight of truth, and a prosecution built on fragile evidence cannot withstand the scrutiny of time. In Part 5, we confront the final and most difficult chapter of this story, the search for truth in a case where every answer leads to another question, and where the shadow of an unsolved murder still hangs over Baltimore, over the legal system, and over everyone whose lives were forever altered by that day in 1999. Part 5 is the reckoning. Every case reaches a point where the evidence ends and the questions begin. A point where the investigation no longer leads you forward, but pulls you inward. A point where the pursuit of truth becomes less about facts and more about confronting what you cannot know. For the murder of Hae Min Lee, that point has stretched across 25 years. And even now, after all the testimony, all the appeals, all the podcasts, documentaries, reports, and reinvestigations, we are left with a truth that remains painfully incomplete. As I sit with the entire weight of this case, the interviews, the timelines, the contradictions, the forensic reports, I realize that the story of Adnan Syed is no longer just a criminal case. It is a mirror held up to the justice system. It reflects the fragility of investigations built on assumptions, the danger of narratives that move faster than evidence, and the cost of decisions made under pressure. But beneath all of that, there is a deeper truth. A young woman lost her life. And despite everything we have learned, we still do not know with certainty what truly happened on the afternoon of January 13th, 1999. To reach the end of this story, we must walk backward through the labyrinth one more time. We begin with the victim. Hae Min Lee was more than a case file. She was an 18-year-old woman with dreams of becoming an optician, with responsibilities at home, with friends who adored her, with a boyfriend she cared about, with a future she was building. She vanished in the small gap between one obligation and another, as if swallowed by time itself. The tragedy of her death cannot be overshadowed by the legal drama that followed. At the core of this case is a life interrupted. But what happened to her remains the question that haunts everything. If we accept the prosecution's narrative, she was killed by her ex-boyfriend in a moment of sudden rage, then buried with the help of a friend. Yet, the evidence does not support spontaneity. The timeline is too tight, the burial too hurried, yet somehow executed without forensic trace, the physical evidence too non-existent, and the motive too weak to withstand the scrutiny of time. If we accept Jay's narrative, we must also accept the contradictions within it. His story bends in ways that truth does not bend. It changes shape in ways that memory does not change. And yet, within the shifting versions, there may be fragments of something real, something that lies beneath the revisions, something that suggests he knew more than he admitted. Some investigators believe that Jay may have been present for parts of the crime that he did not confess to. Some believe that he feared someone other than Adnan. Some believe he altered his story to protect himself or to protect someone else. And some believe he was manipulated into a narrative crafted by investigators who needed a suspect more than they needed certainty. But if Jay's version is not reliable, then the case collapses, and we are left with a mystery far darker and far more unbounded than the courtroom version allowed. What if Hae encountered someone she knew? What if her killer was not impulsive but opportunistic? What if her death was unrelated to her breakup with Adnan? What if the real motive lay outside the school hallways entirely? There were individuals in her orbit with histories of violence. There were unexplored leads. There were inconsistencies in the body's condition that suggested alternative timelines. And there was one chilling possibility that no one wanted to consider, that the true killer may have gone unnoticed because investigators stopped looking once they found a suspect that fit a convenient story. As I sift through the evidence, I cannot ignore the failures of the original investigation, a flawed timeline, misinterpreted data, a star witness who contradicted himself at nearly every turn, an alibi witness ignored, forensic evidence left untested for years, and a series of decisions driven more by narrative momentum than investigative rigor. Yet, despite these failures, the truth remains elusive. This case forces us to confront a difficult reality. The justice system is built for closure, not uncertainty. It seeks answers, even when the evidence does not provide them. It demands conclusions, even when the truth remains out of reach. And once a story takes hold, once a suspect is chosen, every piece of evidence bends to support the chosen narrative. But truth does not bend. When Adnan was released in 2022, the world expected closure. Instead, the story fractured. Some celebrated his freedom. Some demanded justice for Hae. Some insisted the wrong man had been imprisoned for decades. Others insisted a guilty man had walked free. And the legal system, trapped in its own contradictions, reinstated the conviction on procedural grounds, not because the evidence had regained its strength, but because the process had been flawed. This is the tragedy of the case. Both families continue to suffer. Hae's family remains without final answers. Adnan's family remains in limbo. The public remains divided, and the truth remains buried somewhere between the known and the unknowable. So what do we do when we reach the edge of certainty? What remains when the evidence ends? As a detective, I have learned that some cases are not solved through definitive answers. Some are solved through understanding the limits of what we know. Some are solved through the acknowledgement of doubt. and some remain unsolved because the world was not ready to understand them when they happened. Yet, even unresolved stories can teach us something. This case teaches us about the dangers of tunnel vision, about the importance of forensic integrity, about the fallibility of memory, about the responsibility investigators carry when shaping narratives, about the weight of decisions made under pressure, and about the human cost of a justice system that sometimes values closure over truth. What happened to Hae Min Lee on that winter afternoon may never be fully known. The truth may lie with someone who has never spoken. It may lie in a moment lost to time. It may lie in evidence never collected, or it may lie in a combination of details scattered across the case, details that do not yet form a complete picture. And perhaps the most haunting possibility of all is this: the truth might not fit the story that anyone expects. As I close this final part of the documentary, I do not offer conclusions. I offer questions, the same questions that remain unanswered after 25 years. Who killed Hae Min Lee? What really happened on January 13th, 1999? Did the justice system fail an innocent man? Did it fail a young woman whose killer was never truly pursued? And can a case like this ever truly be resolved? In my work as Miller Files, I have learned that justice is not a guarantee. It is a pursuit, a process, a promise we make to the truth, even when the truth refuses to reveal itself. The case of Adnan Syed remains open, not in the courts, but in the conscience of everyone who seeks justice. And until the day the truth emerges, we continue to search in the dark, guided not by certainty, but by the relentless need to understand. This is where the documentary ends, but the story does not.